What up, YouTube? This your boy, Coach Fi, aka Coach Thomas. I'm here to break down the game between UConn and Duke, with UConn coming out successful with the 73-72 win over Duke Blue Devils. It was an Elite Eight matchup, and Duke was the overall #1 seed, and UConn on the other hand was the defending powerhouse with the March Madness pedigree. This wasn't just a game. In my eyes, this was like a legacy versus the pressure game. The first half of the story was Duke pretty much was dominant. They led by as much as 19 points. They was pretty much up 44-29 at halftime, and they shot 52% from the field, 40% from three. Now, obviously, if they would have kept up that, if they were able to sustain that, the outcome would have been a whole lot different than it was. But it's tough to keep up that type of momentum for the course of 40 minutes in a ball game. Duke came out like they were trying to end the game early. They pretty much punched UConn in the mouth. You know what I mean? Because everything was clicking. Offensively, defensively, they were pretty much giving it to UConn. But the second half comes and UConn was able to flip the script, and they outscored Duke 44-28 in the second half. Duke struggled a little bit. Well, not even a little bit, but a lot, because in the second half, they had 13 turnovers, which was huge considering that UConn was only shooting 22% from the 3-point line. They're one of those teams that live and die by the three for the most part, but they shot 5 of 20. They was 5 of 23 from the 3-point line that night. The scary part, UConn didn't even play a clean offensive game, but they stayed close enough, to steal it down the stretch. While they did struggle on the outside, Terrence Reed held them down with 26 points and 9 rebounds. But on the other side, it was pretty much like a balanced effort, mixed with toughness on the inside. He carried them when nothing else was working. It's a plus when somebody can give you something down low when, your guards or guys that you depend on from the outside is not clicking. So the easier buckets that you can get, along with the defensive poise that the guys that UConn had, it made a huge difference in the ball game, in the outcome. Cameron Boozer led Duke with 27 points, 8 rebounds. Caden Boozer had 15 points, 6 assists, which is not bad, but when it comes down to it in crunch time, you got to make plays. A lot of people think that the Boozer twins did their job, which they did. They didn't do bad, but this game wasn't lost because of them. There was some inconsistencies, some inexperience, not only from the player standpoint, but also from the coaching standpoint. There was some inexperiences. So just kind of blow a 19-point lead with the amount of firepower that Duke has, there are some questions that really need to be answered. But it's not up to us. That's something that the coaching staff at Duke will, I'm sure, by now they've broken it down, and, they can only learn and get better from this. Otherwise, they'll end up like North Carolina. The final sequence, let's say Duke was up late, UConn misses. There's a scramble deflection at midcourt, turnover by Caden Boozer at half court. I think he made, in that moment, it's hard. First of all, there's no coaching in the moment. You just kind of gotta sit back and allow players to, trust your players that you have out there in crunch time. As a coach, you look great if Caden Boozer was able to make that pass, because if you look at the film, there were 2 guys wide open on the other end of the floor, and that could have pretty much sealed the game. So I can see why Coach Shire did not call a timeout at that point. You're just hoping. If he calls a timeout and the pass is successful, then everybody's going to be looking at him like, why did he call that timeout? But he didn't call a timeout. He trusts his player who he had trusted the whole season. And, unfortunately, the pass was deflected. It was a steal, and, Braylon Mullen hits a 35-footer and credit to UConn for not forcing anything. They got the steal. They remained patient. They found an open guy, and Braylon just hit a tough shot. It just wasn't Duke's night at that point. This was one of those losses that's definitely going to stick with everybody on that in that Duke organization for years to come. Not only in that organization, but from players past. If you look at what's the guy's name? You look at Grant Hill. You look at Grant Hill's expression. Grant Hill had to remain professional in what he was doing, but best believe he was pissed and stunned by that. You know, being a Duke legend and alumni, that one had to sting, and as he was covering that game. But to be up 19 and to lose a game in that fashion was kind of tough. Duke led 90. So, and pretty much UConn has that championship DNA. Duke does too, but it's been a while. But Duke, UConn stayed poised. They didn't panic despite the poor shooting that they had. They didn't win pretty, but they won like champions. At the end of the day, they lived to fight another day. Turnovers are game changers. Duke had 13 turnovers, UConn with 5. But the way UConn executes their sets is, it's a coaching clinic. It's a clinic for guys, for coaches, players. If you're just a fan of the game, you got to love the way UConn plays and how they execute. They run from one set to the next. One set, they run from one action in their sets to the next. They have 3 or 4 options that they get to. You stop one option, you stop the second one, you stop the third one, and then that fourth one is going to kill you. But you got to remain disciplined defensively when you're playing defense against a team like UConn. So kudos to them. They're well coached. Coach Hurley does a great job with them. And on top of that, he recruits guys that fit his program. In a day now where it's a lot of run and gun, and if you're one of those kids or players that pretty much you think you're going to have the ball in your hands a lot, UConn is not a place for you to go. They move the ball well, they execute. They do a lot of off the ball actions that if you fall asleep defensively, you got to be a good passer, you got to be a good decision maker. So UConn is a top level program by that blue blood is serious, and in order for you to play there, their playbook is extensive. They have an extensive playbook. And at the end of the day, you just got to be the better team for one night. Sometimes the best team doesn't win. The tough ones get it done. And UConn, they were poised. They got some veteran players on the other end, and they got the job done. So they march on to the Final Four, and I'm looking forward to it. So make sure that you come back and get a hot take. Follow, subscribe, get a hot take from me. You know what I mean? Going forward, we will have the podcast where I have another coach, a lot of other coaches on the panel, and we will be breaking down sports from high school level, college level, and some NBA level. Football, basketball, all of that. So in closing, let's go.